During this session, it's my pleasure to chair this session, which for those of you, this is psychosocial hazards and workplace violence. And we have what look like three very interesting presentations coming up. We're going to do the three in the order that they come in the program, and then we'll save questions until after all three presenters have done, are complete. So what I'll suggest when we move to the question and answer period, if you just raise your hand, I'll be watching the participant bar to sort of note when people raise your hand in the little, using the little icon thing in the participant section. Or if you want to drop a question in the chat, I'll try and keep an eye on that too. But the most efficient method will be just to raise your hand in the participation section. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Robert Hickey from Queen's University to do his paper. Robert?
Thanks, Jason. Let me just get the presentation up here. Good afternoon, or whatever time zone everyone's in. So my research is focused on community social services in Ontario, and I'll explain a little bit of what that sector is and who the workers are. But let me just start with a little bit of background and context and kind of what's motivated this current program of research and whose support and collaboration I've benefited from. And let me start with the alphabet soup of OPSU, OCOW, and COPSOC. So OPSU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and in particular, Terri Szymanski, their Director of Health and Safety, is someone who I've worked with for years. And she and I, about a year ago, started talking about doing a survey of the community social services sector in Ontario on issues related to psychosocial health and safety. And she's been very involved in the development of the survey instrument, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And OPSU is also the largest union in the sector, along with CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And this particular sector, this kind of subsegment of the community social services workforce, is what we call the developmental services sector. So these are workers and organizations that provide supports, residential supports, community supports to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are about 35,000 workers in Ontario, and about 74%, unionization rate of about 74%, which is consistent with the broader public service in Ontario. So fairly high union density, particularly when you compare it with other jurisdictions like Alberta or the US states. And most of these organizations are community-based nonprofit organizations, not large for-profit operators like you might find in long-term care or other areas. I've also worked closely with the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, and in particular John Udek there, who's the occupational hygienist, and he's been instrumental in developing what we call the Mental Injury Toolkit. So if you're interested in that, just Google OCOW, and it's a fairly robust approach to looking at mental health in workplaces here, in particular Ontario. And it's not just about measuring, it's about kind of changing organization, changing the environmental conditions to eliminate psychosocial hazards. And I'll get back to that point in a moment. Finally, this research is based upon the COPSOC3, the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, and there are a lot of different survey instruments out there, but excuse me, this is one that OCOW has worked with and adapted to the Ontario or Canadian context. And beneficially for this program of research, they've done some fairly large-scale representative samples of the Canadian of the Canadian labor force. So I'll be able to share some benchmark comparator data between what I've surveyed and what John found Canada-wide. Now, a little bit more on kind of where this research came from. I'm certainly no expert in mental health or workplace mental health, but I'd say our field in general, and I mean kind of employment relations, IR, and HR practitioners, have certainly, along with the broader society, paid more attention to workplace mental health and kind of a shifting attitude, both in relation to stigma, but also in relation to organizational responsibility. So back a number of years ago, the standards, the Canadian standards were published. And these are not requirements, but these kind of set out for the first time what are the organizational and workplace factors associated with psychological health and safety. And that shift has been important, but it's a shift from an individual label to an occupational health and safety issue that I would say is fairly incomplete, and in particular in this sector. So this is actually an online magazine produced by colleagues that I know at the University of Minnesota and the National Association for Direct Support Professionals. So this is the classification of workers that I've been looking at. And of course, a lot of the mental health in the workplace emphasis is on resilience and mindfulness and self-care, not on hazard elimination or what I would call kind of organizational controls towards psychosocial hazards. So this research, what I'm trying to do is to look to see, well, to what extent are workplace factors important to psychosocial health? So the core research question is really what can this case of the community-based social service workforce in Ontario teach us about psychosocial health and safety? The measures that I use are a variety of workplace factors, about 19 different workplace factors as part of that COPSOC survey instrument, like influence in the workplace, recognition, quality of leadership, emotional demands, work pace, things like that. I've added a few others of interest, compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction, psychosocial safety climate, self-reported health, and demographic and control measures as well. Now, I worked on kind of preparing this program of research with Terri and other unions and employers in the sector for about a year. And I had the unfortunate timing of putting the survey into the field on March 1st. So I had about 2 weeks of good participation before kind of the world stopped, and this program of research has been somewhat derailed as a result of the current pandemic. And I'm not able to discern much in terms of kind of pre-shutdown versus post-shutdown psychosocial positions. But anyway, I'll share what I have from that from these initial findings. I did get 1,400 completed surveys. And again, that's out of a pool of about 35,000 workers. It's well short of what my goal was for this program. A lot of large employers didn't have time to distribute the survey before lockdown. But this is a profile of the participants. So I not only collected surveys from frontline workers who we call direct support professionals, but I also have responses from supervisors, senior managers, administrative staffs, specialized professionals, and others. The vast majority, though, are the frontline workforce. 72% are DSPs. This is a very gendered sector. 87% of respondents are women, and that's consistent with previous research in the sector. Unlike other jurisdictions, seniority in this sector tends to be fairly high, particularly amongst full-time workers. So 6 to 10 years on average, higher for supervisors, up to 18 years on average for supervisor seniority. The employment status highlights the failings of this current survey because it's not representative of the workforce. 68% of respondents in this pool are full-time, but I know that actually 2/3 of the workforce are part-time. So part-time workers are not represented. And that could be part of the pandemic effects, as well as the opportunity to work at multiple agencies was eliminated. Interestingly, looking at the one question about, are you compelled to work extra hours without pay? Almost 1/3 of the respondents said yes, but that was mostly concentrated amongst supervisors and senior managers. Rotating or irregular schedules and their health effects are a concern. But again, I think it's an underestimate because of the overrepresentation of full-time workers in this survey pool. The last two things I want to draw attention to in terms of the profile is the preponderance of multiple job holding in this sector. So in this sample, 35% of respondents said they held an additional job. And that's pretty consistent with previous research I've done, finding about 41%, which is incredibly high. It's about 5 times higher, according to Statistics Canada, than the broader health and human service workforce. So a large proportion of workers are working at multiple agencies or working in multiple sectors. Finally, this sector, although the workforce isn't paid very well, they do have a very high educational attainment rate. Kind of the target educational credential is for a college diploma called a DSW, Developmental Service Worker Diploma. And about 55% have a college diploma, but if you open that up and look at other post-secondary certificates, another 31% have a university or advanced degree. So, you know, close to 90% of the workforce has a post-secondary credential of some sort, so a highly educated workforce. So looking at the psychosocial factors, this summary is a bit crowded, I know. It just gives you a sense of all the different factors that we looked at. The orange bars are the mean rates for the current survey. The blue bars are that Canadian reference group that I was mentioning earlier by OCAL using the same survey instrument. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of matched pairs because this is the one of the interesting findings, initial findings. If we look in particular at emotional demands, the rate of exposure to emotional demands is much higher in this population than the Canadian labor force in general. But at the same time, workers in this sector also reported much higher levels of seeing this work as being personally meaningful, and kind of the important psychosocial implications of that, I think, is interesting. The other match pair I want to highlight is this lower rate of feeling that there are possibilities for development in this sector. And in some ways, that's not terribly surprising. Most of these organizations, nonprofit organizations, fairly small, very flat organizations, not a lot of layers of supervisors or managers. So in terms of traditional forms of career development, they're not present. And all my previous research has found that job satisfaction with opportunities for development is consistently the lowest area of job satisfaction, lower than wages and benefits even. So that was not surprising. What is surprising is you have this low possibilities for development with a workforce that indicated a higher commitment to the workplace than the Canadian benchmark. And just to drill down on these two in greater detail, you'll see, again, emotional demands. This is the ratings benchmarked against the Canadian reference group. Over 70% of the respondents reported worse or much worse emotional demands than the Canadian reference group. But at the same time, over 50%, over half, strongly find that their work is personally meaningful. So you have this kind of simultaneous pulling in either direction, with emotional demands driving psychosocial hazards and meaningful work, kind of one of the mitigating factors, also strong and present. Same for those other two possibilities for development. Nearly half feeling worse than the Canadian reference group, but at the same time showing fairly high rates of commitment to the workplace in comparison to that Canadian benchmark. I did find some differences by job classification, and I thought this slide would be interesting given the topic of the next presenters related to job satisfaction and kind of workload. So here, looking at work pace and quantitative demands with job satisfaction, you see that the highest job satisfaction is amongst senior managers, but they also were the ones not complaining, but reporting highest quantitative demands and work pace demands. The same with supervisors. So lower job satisfaction amongst direct support professionals, but also less intense work pace, less intense quantitative demands. So again, you have this kind of dichotomous experience of highly charged environments with fast work pace, significant demands on senior managers, but they're also the ones with the highest job satisfaction for other reasons, influence and development and those types of things. Measuring psychological safety, I used work by Dollard and her colleagues on this. And this is one question that I had benchmark data to compare it with. And it's interesting to see that respondents tended to feel that their organization tolerates behaviors harmful to mental health. And this is kind of something that will require, I think, more investigation, but it's clearly reflecting a climate that is troublesome. And one area where I think will be fruitful to look at is exposure to offensive behaviors. So we asked participants, have you experienced undesired sexual attention, threats of violence, physical violence, harassment, discrimination, and so forth. And the exposure to violence and the threats of violence were much higher than I had anticipated. And just to explain what this reflects is, these are workers working with people who may have dual diagnosis, mental health conditions, along with intellectual disabilities. So the exposure to self-harm, the exposure to challenging behavior, we've known that that's an issue in this sector for some time, but it really stands out in terms of the responses here. Now, it's much different than, say, amongst corrections officers, because many of these workers are drawn to the sector and embrace a disability rights philosophy. So they're not blaming the people they support, who are typically the sources of these challenging behaviors, but they also see that this widespread experience and kind of the lack of an organizational response to protecting workers from violence.
Sorry, Robert, you have 2 minutes.
Perfect. Probably contributes to that sense of lack of psychosocial safety climate. Looking at some of the initial correlations, you'll notice the consistent patterns here with overall health, stress, and burnout. The top two negative correlations are emotional demands and role conflict. So emotional demands may seem a little more individual, but role conflict is certainly the kind of the organization of work and direction of work. And so that workplace factor was clearly seen as a contributor to psychosocial hazards. Conversely, recognition really stood out as a mitigating factor. High levels of feeling like your work is recognized was associated with higher levels of overall health and less stress. And safety climate makes a big difference. So if we look at all the workplace factors, looking at people who reported low levels of psychosocial safety versus high levels, you can see that the trends are fairly clear and in some areas rather substantial. So looking at recognition. Now we don't know which way the causation is going. It's just a correlation. So those who felt recognized also tended to report positive psychosocial climates. Same with health, self-reported health measures. If you reported high psychosocial health and safety climate, you tended to report lower rates of burnout, lower rates of stress, and slightly higher overall health. So just to conclude, and I know this is all very initial, kind of at a simplistic level, this does show that work organization and ER employment relations are central to psychosocial health. It's not just about resilience or mindfulness or individual coping strategies. But it also, I think, highlights in this sector anyway, the seeming incompatibility or mixed messages of high emotional demands. So something that would clearly be a very prevalent and powerful hazard, along with strong mitigating factors, things that would promote psychosocial well-being, like compassion, satisfaction, and meaningful work. So being able to disentangle hazards and positive factors will be one of the next steps. Clearly, there are different experiences by job classification and employment status. And one of the other kind of conclusions or initial findings is the fixed effects of organization. So in that pool of 1,400, I probably have about 50 different organizations. And those organizations where there's a positive employee relations climate, where there's an effective management team, you see that those effects carry throughout psychosocial health and safety as well. So feeling like you're being recognized, feeling like you have a say, a voice in the organization are kind of consistent across the organization and not limited to one area.
You should wrap up, please, Robert.
That's it.
Oh, aha. Okay, well, thank you. As I say, we'll save questions for after all three presenters have done. So we'll just move without further ado to Firat Sayin and his colleagues to look at workload and job satisfaction of personal support workers. Firat, you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Let me start with sharing my screen, if possible. Let's just do this. Can you see my screen right now?
Well, we did for a second, but oh, yep, there we go. Yes, we do.
Do you see it as the presentation or like a presenter's view?
You've got it as a presenter's view.
Okay. What about right now?
There you go.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Firat. I'm an assistant professor at St. Mary's University in the east coast of Canada. In this study, my co-authors are Margaret, Denton, Sharon, Davies, and Isik Zeytinoglu from McMaster University, and Catherine Brookman from CB Consulting. And the title of our study is Workload and Job Satisfaction of Personal Support Workers in Ontario, Canada, the Mediating Role of Stress and Workplace Violence and Harassment. So first, I will give you some context because I think the audience is fairly international and not everybody might be very familiar with the healthcare system in Canada. Then I will briefly introduce personal support workers, and if I can, I will play a very short video if it's accessible. After providing some conceptual background, I will introduce the model and methods, results, and I'll complete the presentation with discussion. So as most other developed countries, Canada is a rapidly aging country. This creates a certain stress on healthcare sector since in the last 3 decades, since 1990s, specifically with the rising costs and lower government funding. So this creates a higher demand for home and community care because specifically in a age-in-place approach. In more simpler terms, we have many elderly who could support their lives with some support. If not, they would have to be placed in retirement homes or hospitals, which creates substantial stress on the healthcare sector. So this also leads to, in another perspective, with higher demand and lower resources, there is a pressure on healthcare workers to do more. So with this context, let me also add that violence and harassment is a phenomenon experienced in basically all sectors, but it is particularly high in the healthcare sector all over the world, including Canada. And this is also especially true in long-term care institutions or those who provide healthcare services in the home of the client. And in this study, we specifically look at long-term care institutions and home care institutions. I want to just play this quick video. Please let me know if it doesn't play for you or you can hear the sound. If not, I can just skip it.
Yeah, we're not getting the sound.
You are not getting the sound?
No.
Okay, never mind then. So this basically just a short video telling how there's a shortage of personal support workers and what they essentially do. But it's okay. I'll just skip to the next slide and try to tell you a little bit just myself. So personal support workers, they're also known as PSWs. In some other countries, they are known as support workers or nurse aides, nursing aides. They are actually the largest occupational group in this sector in Canada. They are not as much studied as physicians or nurses, but they are actually the largest occupational group. And interestingly, again, unlike nurses or physicians or doctors, it's a non-regulated occupation. So you don't need to be registered to become a personal support worker. So personal support workers are very important because they provide care for elderly, post-acute patients, people with disabilities. And in most cases, they do this in the care recipient's residence, or it could be retirement home or some community organization supporting housing program. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's a higher demand as the population gets older, because when the population gets older, it's not only about just being elderly, but the rate of disability also increases. Demand of care increases, but because of the stagnant government funding, the staffing is insufficient. So the workload increases, and PSWs have to do more in less time. Furthermore, because of the limited funding, they are typically not paid well. Not all, but many of them actually receive around minimum wage, maybe a bit higher. Of course, some of them get higher, paid higher, but most of them have a quite low pay. So when personal support workers facing these limitations, they cannot provide adequate care. Some frustrated care recipients or their families, they could resort to violence and harassment, which brings to the main point of this study. So conceptually, we base our model on demand control model and effort reward imbalance model, which basically says that work factors shape individual stress, and stress could shape job satisfaction. So here, let's just introduce the important concept for this paper, which is structural violence. Structural violence is basically a broad definition of violence. So when we are talking about violence, we could be thinking about someone just hitting someone or abusing someone in a physical, psychological, or sexual, or whatever way. This structural violence also includes indirect actions. For example, one indirect action would be poor working conditions. Previous research shows that there is a structural violence in the healthcare sector because the working conditions are really poor for many workers. So here, one factor that shapes this working condition is we consider as a workload. As I mentioned previously, workload increases, and it's an important environmental factor. And as the workload increases, it contributes to the risk of workplace violence and harassment. So a more indirect violence, which is structural violence, which is an increased workload, leads to direct violence, which is the violence and harassment experienced by personal support workers. Then we have job satisfaction. I won't get into deep into it, but it's basically shaped by work environment. Here I would like to just come to Robert's point. If I understand correctly, he was talking about how senior managers have a both high job satisfaction, even though they are experiencing a fast work pace. Normally, we would experience them, these two, to be somewhat negatively correlated. So here's the thing. Job satisfaction, most people in this literature basically take it as one dimension, and they don't usually distinguish between extrinsic and intrinsic job satisfaction. This might not be necessary for all jobs, but especially for insecure and casual jobs, and personal support work happens to be this kind of job. It is important to differentiate extrinsic job satisfaction and intrinsic job satisfaction to understand what's actually going on. When I talk about intrinsic job satisfaction, I'm talking about the basically internal rewards that we feel about our job. It could be, for example, how meaningful you find your job. On the other hand, extrinsic job satisfaction focuses on the more tangible aspect of job satisfaction. For example, am I happy with my pay? Do I feel secure in my job? And whatnot. So we differentiated these two in this study because of the precarious nature of personal support workers. So this is just a very brief conceptual background. So based on this conceptual background, we developed this model where dependent variable is the workload, independent variable is the workload, and extrinsic and intrinsic job satisfaction are the dependent variables. And we have violence and harassment at work and stress as the mediators. So we hypothesize that workload will have a positive association with violence and harassment at work. Violence and harassment at work will have a positive association with stress, and stress will have a negative association with both types of job satisfactions. So while testing these, we also tested if the violence and harassment at work and stress are mediators of the impact of workload on extrinsic and intrinsic job satisfaction. So that's what these dashes indicate. So let me quickly talk about methods. So this data is collected in the largest province of Canada, Ontario. So it's an Ontario Word survey conducted in 2015 in both electronic and paper format. 1,746 personal support workers completed the entire survey. We used list-wise deletion, and after list-wise deletion, we had 1,387 respondents. Of course, non-response bias could be an important indicator, so we replicated the results using model-based imputation to account for item non-response. After checking the literature, we controlled for a few variables, including tenure, immigration status, education level, and whether the respondents lived alone or not. In terms of statistical technique, we use descriptive statistics, correlations, and structural equation modeling with maximum likelihood estimation. And goodness of fitness indices show that the model has a good fit. So just a very quick overview of the snapshot, if you will, of our sample. There are moderate levels of extrinsic, and there is a moderate level of extrinsic job satisfaction, but a higher, moderately higher level of intrinsic job satisfaction. About a bit more than 1/5 of our respondents reported that they experienced violence, some form of violence and harassment at work. There was a moderately high level of stress. Likewise, we can see the workload here as well. The average tenure working as personal support workers is about 10 years. A bit more than 60% of the respondents are immigrants. And as you will see, more than 2/3 of the respondents have a college degree or higher, and about 15% of them live alone. So now let's look at the inferential analysis results. Basically, all of our hypotheses were supported. We found that workload has a positive relationship with violence and harassment at work. Violence and harassment at work has a positive relationship with stress, and stress has negative relationships with extrinsic and intrinsic job satisfaction. So these are the direct effects. We also looked at the indirect effects, which are indicated by dashes. I won't go to all of them one by one, but the ones that we hypothesized, which is, as you will see in the dash between workload and extrinsic and intrinsic job satisfaction, shows that both violence and harassment at work and stress are the mediators of the impact of workload on both types of job satisfactions. So in this study, to cap up, we basically examined the role of workload in workplace violence and harassment, and how this shapes stress and eventually job satisfaction. So we found that workload, the impact of workload on extrinsic and intrinsic job satisfaction is partially mediated by violence and harassment at work and stress. So basically, we found that the experience of workplace and harassment escalates with increased workload. So in terms of contributions, we know that especially in human resource management studies, also employment relations to an increasing degree, contextual factors such as workload, as we studied in this, examined in this study, are understudied, and we shed some light on this understudied phenomenon rather than looking at direct violence relationships from a relational perspective. We also extended the demand control model and effort reward imbalance model by introducing violence and harassment and tried to integrate these two models to a certain degree. When it comes to practical implications, obviously the workload needs to be lessened. So personal support workers experience less violence and harassment, so they can feel more satisfied with their jobs. And job satisfaction is important because it is determinant of important factors such as the quality of care provided and received by care recipients, and personal support workers' intention to stay in their organization and in their profession, which we would like them to stay, because, well, obviously there's a shortage of them anyway. For the sustainability of our healthcare sector, we need them badly. So obviously more government funding is definitely needed to improve the working conditions of personal support workers. From an organizational perspective, perhaps we need a more standardized organizational orientation, more training. That should be mandatory for all personal support workers. Okay, so Of course, we have a number of limitations, but just to mention two of them, this is a cross-sectional study, so we cannot clearly talk about causality. And the representative of this sample is not clear, even though we did some demographic comparison with some other countries and Canadian healthcare sector in general. The problem is, like I said, personal support workers are not registered, so we don't know the total number of personal support workers in Ontario or Canada, which basically means that we don't know our response rate, or we cannot just compare our averages with the national or provincial average. So we cannot be sure how representative these results are. So that said, basically we would like to thank our research advisory committee and our funder, Ontario Ministry of Labour. And thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you. That's amazing timing. I didn't give you your 2-minute warning because you were on your last slide, so well done.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, again, we'll hold the questions until after all the presentations are done. So we'll move to our last presenters, Ana Virginia Moreira Gomes and Benedito Augusto de Silva Neto. And if I've mispronounced your names, I apologize. I don't know how you'll be divvying up your presentation, but I leave it to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm presenting today, but Benedito is here and he can be part of the questions if there is the case. And well, we will our research is on the legal field, so I think will be interesting to see how it dialogue with the other works presented here. And I will share my screen. Just a minute. Okay. So I hope everybody can watch. Our study is an analysis of comparative law between Brazil and Uruguay concerning this new ILO convention that was approved last year, ILO Convention 190, on violence and harassment at work. The idea, and here I have a little map, Brazil and Uruguay, and Uruguay was the first country to ratify an ILO convention last month. This month, Fiji has also ratified the convention, which means that next year on June, the convention enters in force in the international sphere. So it's able to be ratified and it will be able to create international obligations. The approval of this convention was a milestone in the fight against violence, harassment, and discrimination in the workplace. These practices that, as we have seen here, are still extremely common. In addition to its pioneer spirit, the convention brings very interesting and innovative regulatory strategies. It extends its protection to informal workers or workers who are not registered. It also conceives the streets as work environment in the case of street workers. It brings the concept of violence and harassment at work based on gender and relates the work environment and work violence and harassment to domestic violence. Last but not least, the convention is a human rights standard at work, with violence and harassment being considered an offensive violation and abuse of human rights, incompatible with decent work and threatening equal opportunities in the workplace and in the work environment. The approval of this convention has the potential to change the reality in the work, initially through the ratification of the treaty by a member state and the compliance of national law with the terms of the convention. This is considered to be like the initial step. The ratification doesn't mean that the country will change its behavior, but it's the first step for this to happen. So it's essential at this stage to start to think about the conformity or incompatibilities and gaps of the national systems in relation to the principles and rules of Convention 190. And this is the goal of this study, taking as case studies Brazil and Uruguay. The choice of Uruguay is justified because it was the first country to ratify the convention, and the Brazilian one because that's our country. So the analysis tries to bring these two countries, identifying and understanding the path and the obstacles that they will face in trying to turn their national orders compatible with the principles of Convention 190. As I said, the convention deals, in here I have the convention in the recommendation that it's a kind of a more concrete norm that regulates the principles in the convention. They consist as normative instrument to fight against violence and harassment. The convention initially brings a joint concept of violence and harassment, very general, leaving space for member states to, according to their national culture and legal orders, to create their own concept or different concepts of violence and harassment. What we can extract from here is the idea that harassment needs this repeat actions, while violence can occur only a single time. It already characterizes the occurrence of violence. As I had said, the convention adopts these very innovative regulatory strategies by extending labor protection to all categories of workers, regardless of their contractual situation, people in training, apprentices, and interns, for those whose employment contract is no longer in force, volunteers, people looking for employment, and even those exercising the role of employer. The protection applied to all sectors, public and private, formal and informal economy, urban or rural. And that's very important because usually informal workers and workers who are in the most precarious form of work are the ones more vulnerable to violence and harassment. And usually they were excluded from labor law protection, but this convention takes a step further, guaranteeing the protection of these workers. And it means a lot when we think, for example, in countries in South America and other developing countries where the informal market is a very significant parcel of the labor market in general. I think that's one of the most important aspects of this convention. What else? The convention also brings providing protection, as I said, both in the place where the service is provided and in related or derived space, such as public or private places, including the point at which the worker received his remuneration, rest and lodging environments, or for meals provided by the employer, as well as in bathrooms and changing rooms.
Anna, are you still there?
Are we still connected?
We seem to have lost Anna, I think.
Okay. Yeah, for a moment I thought it might have been my side, but it looks like everybody's still here.
Okay, well, maybe we'll just wait a minute or two and see if Anna is able to get herself brought back in.
Okay.
Guess this is the risks of doing an international conference via Zoom. Sweet connections.
Yeah, I mean, what would make it better would be like a wired connection directly attached to the router or something like that. I think Wi-Fi sometimes is a bit risky.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe then, well, let's give another minute or two. If we don't get Anna back in the next minute or two, maybe what we can do is we can move on to questions to the other presenters, and then hopefully she can work her way back to finish her presentation before the end of the session. Oh, that's looking hopeful. Hello, Anna, are you back?
I'm back. The internet. So should I
Yeah.
just continue? I'll make it shorter.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Share my screen. Okay. Okay. So let me go back a little bit here. Sorry. Okay, so going to the two countries. In Uruguay does not have a specific legislation against harassment at work, and there are many problems that result from this, this regulatory gap. The jurisprudence plays an essential role in cases of harassment and exercising this function of trying to integrate, to fill this gap in the legal system. The judge recognized as a fundamental and a human right the right to work in a work environment with health conditions. And it is from this more general rule that they, from there, they take specific rules concerning the prohibition of harassment. In the absence of a legal concept established by the law, it's very important to try to make concrete behaviors, typical behaviors that would be prohibited by law. This is of central importance to avoid kind of very subjective evaluations of what would be especially harassment, that it's not always physical. In many cases, workplace harassment has been mistaken for a mere conflict, and even more often, the victims are stigmatized under the label of conflictive workers. Rightly, the courts have tried to demolish this myth. In cases where the worker believes it is impossible to continue the employment relationship, given the conduct of the employer, the courts have also started to recognize the right to indirect dismissal. In Brazil, there is also no specific law regarding private sector workers and federal civil servants to prevent and prohibit harassment in the workplace. As in Uruguay, we have a more general constitutional norm guaranteeing to all workers a healthy and safe work environment. This is like a general norm that the courts use also to try to fill this gap. And also Law 9029 from 95, which is our general anti-discrimination law at work, that does not refer explicitly to the prohibition of workplace harassment, but it constitutes the legal basis to identify, punish, indemnify, and prohibit harassment practice that are based on discriminatory actions for the purpose of admission or for the purpose of permanence on the job. The labor courts also have in their jurisprudence integrate the labor order concerning the identifying of the conduct of harassment at work and outlining its consequences in the employment relationship, including trying to make it more concrete, the idea of the employer's liability. Here we have the state's obligation deriving from Convention 190, enactment of specific laws and development of public policies, the adoption of support measures for victims and protection of groups considered vulnerable, adoption of procedures for receiving complaints about violence and harassment, development of studies to detect the possible influence of domestic violence on labor relations, and ensure a work environment free from violence and harassment, to guarantee the safety and health of workers. the right to equality with the prohibition of all forms of work discrimination. We can see that the convention is, the objectives are very broad, and that in face of the legal order we have now, both in Uruguay and Brazil, there is a lot to advance, especially in terms of the regulatory context for the prohibition of harassment and violence, which is very important to give more certainty even to the public policies to fight against these still very common practices. Some conclusions is the need to develop an anti-harassment and anti-violence regulatory system, as I have said, to build prevention practice inside the companies with the participation of workers, to effectively include violence and harassment on the grounds of gender in the system, and there's a huge for both countries, how not to make labor law regulations that are isolated and apart from the social context of discrimination against women. So this type of regulations should have linkage with the social reality of the countries. And one example that I added here is a law in Brazil against domestic violence that foreseen paid leave for female workers who have been victims of domestic violence. So this type of dialogue between the regulations is very important on the case of the fight against harassment and violence. And build practice and standards that reach informal work. We cannot think that the ratification of this convention will be effective if the regulations only focus on formal work. I think the big challenge that this convention brings is how to regulate and to protect informal work, street work, and the convention is very clear when it calls the responsibility of the public authorities, because usually the state itself is the main violator in the case of workers who work on the streets through police violence, for example. I hope I did not, you could hear me, and sorry for all the coming and going.
Thank you very much, Anna. Yeah, and yes, and I think we're all, it's unfortunate, but we're glad you're back, as it were. So we have some time. And so if anybody has any questions for any of our presenters today, you can raise your hand. I'm sort of watching the participant panel. Or you can slip a note in the chat if you prefer to ask your question sort of indirectly. I could ask it out loud for you. Okay, Anna, do you?
I have a question.
Okay. Go ahead.
It's more like an observation, but I found it very interesting for Firat, that when he talks about structural violence, and that includes the workload and working hours. And one curiosity is that in Brazil, the legal concept of work analogous to slavery includes not only forced labor, but also extreme long hours and exploitative working conditions, which is equivalent to the definition you have used of structural violence. I found it very interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Great presentation, by the way. Yeah, I mean, when we are talking about structural violence or violence or slavery in general, these are actually quite encompassing topics. When we are thinking about slavery, as typical image comes to our mind, but most people, I think, don't even know that the slavery is still existing today, affecting perhaps more than 40 million people in the world in different ways. So I think it's very important to have a more encompassing approach to issues such as violence and slavery, so that we can understand and explain others how these are ongoing issues and there is more than meets the eye. I'm happy that Brazil has the legislation where slavery is not only about the enforced work conditions or the work itself, but has a more general approach to it. That's one of the things we try to bring with this with our research. So yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point.
Thank you for that. I see Danielle Lamb, you have your hand up. Are you wanting to ask a question?
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks very much to all the presenters for your work. I have two questions actually. The first is for Robert. I was just wondering, you may have mentioned this, but I may have missed it. If the results for Canada, the benchmark of the OCAO survey are publicly available, and if they are, maybe you could share where to get them. And my second question is for Firat. In your study on the violence and harassment experiences, are you able to differentiate the source of the violence that the PSWs are experiencing? Is it coming from coworkers, management, or clients or residents? So I'll stop and let you answer. Thanks very much.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Danielle. I don't have the reference at my fingertips, but John Udek, the person I mentioned from OCAO, does have a published paper that presents the Canada data in it. I forget which journal it is. It's more of a health and safety journal, but if you just Google him, you'll find that paper in the publicly available data.
Thank you, Danielle, for your question. I think that's a very important point. When we were looking into literature, one thing we realized is that there are actually quite a number of studies on this topic. So in this study, we basically have a simple question that asks personal support workers if they ever experienced violence and harassment. We don't really differentiate violence or harassment here, or we don't even differentiate the source of it. It could be coming from their supervisors, co-workers, patients, or families. Because when we are talking about structural issues, we believe that it would be more accurate to have a more encompassing view. But of course, I think that would be a great follow-up study to look at the intricacies, the source of the structure, the source of the violence and harassment, but we haven't done it in this study, but it would be a great follow-up study. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We do have one question in the chat group right now, which I'll read out loud, and it's for Firat. Could you comment more on the effects of increased pay on tolerance to workplace violence?
Oh, that's a great question. Maybe, Robert, if you don't mind, you could also jump in, because I think one of your findings were I think, related to this. Pay is, as I mentioned in the paper, related to extrinsic job satisfaction. But having said that, for personal support workers, extrinsic job satisfaction might not be necessarily very high because the pay is typically low. Not in this paper, but in a previous paper that we published. If you are interested, I will be happy to just forward it to you. Where, for example, we found that actually intrinsic job satisfaction shapes personal support workers' decision to leave their organization, but extrinsic job satisfaction has no impact on their intention for turnover or leave their organization. So we assume that this is because the pay is already low, and personal support work, like I assume respondents that Robert had, really care about their job. for their job, caring about people, helping people. It is really a meaningful job. So they focus on, perhaps they focus on the more interesting aspects of it. So I don't have the exact result to answer your question, but my assumption based on this this project and my previous projects and the literature would be increased pay on tolerance to workplace violence would probably be depending on how much increase we are talking about. Because we know that personal support workers really internalize violence coming from the patients as a part of job. Kelly 2017 has a really good article on this. So they just assume that this is a part of the job. We experience violence and harassment from the patients, but that's just part of the job, so that's fine. So from that perspective, an increased pay could be better, but I'm not sure if it's going to tolerate the workplace violence, but that's an excellent point. I'll actually think about it and see if I can bring anything on the table. Thank you.
And I'll just add to that really great point by Firat. In my research in the community social services sector, I haven't found pay to impact tolerance of violence. And much like Firat, workers in this sector are very loath to blame the people they support for the violence they experience. Now, my survey, I did ask the question of the source of those offensive behaviors, and the vast majority of threats of violence and actual violence come from people supported. But these are workers who find tremendous meaning in their work, and they are loath to blame people who have historically been labeled as dangerous or segregated and isolated in institutions. So their concern with the experience of that violence, I think, translates more into the climate of, does management tolerate this without trying to give us the supports that we need to, you know, maybe it's a 2-staff ratio to a certain individual, right? And those tend to be the focus of frustration and concern. Pay certainly makes a difference, but it's more with turnover, and it's very pronounced in part-time workers where they may be very satisfied with their pay, but they're unable to get earnings, you know, stable earnings, because they can't get the hours. So we see tremendous improvement in lowering turnover by increasing pay or stabilizing employment status. But I haven't found a lot of connections between pay and tolerance of violence.
Before I ask for additional questions, there have been through the chats during the session, some people have requested copies of the PowerPoint presentations. Probably, and when we've come across this in other sessions, we figure the simplest way to sort of manage that is if the presenters are willing, they can email me their PowerPoint presentation, and then anyone who wants a copy of those PowerPoints would also email me, and I would be the conduit. So in the chat button, I will share my email address. And so again, if the presenters are willing, they can email me their PowerPoint, and then anyone who wants a copy can also email me, and I'll kind of be the middle person. I'll be the PowerPoint mule, as it were. Any other questions for our presenters at this point? I have one for Robert, if I may. Hang on, I'll just quickly do my email here first. Okay. It's interesting, this might even be a question for both Firat and Robert. Just when I was listening to your presentation, Robert, I was thinking about the Karasek's demand control model, and then Firat actually incorporated it actively in his study. So I wondered if you could just sort of comment a little bit about your findings in the context of the control or lack of control these workers have, even though there's a high demand on them, both emotionally and physically and in workload, how that may have some impact upon the studies you found in your survey.
Absolutely, and I should say that the COPSOC survey instrument kind of explicitly incorporates the demand control theory into the design of the survey. So collected information about feelings of influence at work. And it's consistent with previous research in the sector, which found that predominantly frontline workers didn't feel like their ideas for improving services and supports would be heard and acted upon by management. So there's high emotional demand with low influence, low control. Now I haven't got to the kind of analytical phase of being able to suss out just how significant that is, but you're absolutely right. I would suspect that supervisors and managers tend to have higher job satisfaction and better ratings despite this higher workload because they call the shots, right? They have that high rate of influence and high sense of control, whereas the frontline workers may not experience the same level of quantitative demand, but they're unable to shape their work environment or unable to voice ideas that may improve services and supports.
Thank you. Any other questions for any of our presenters? Again, you can either do it through the chat or just
Jason, if I might just jump in just to add to Robert's point. Robert has a great point. In a previous study that we conducted, we found that you mentioned control, so I will just refer in terms of job autonomy or freedom to do their jobs as we ask personal support workers. It is quite important for them. And one of the main reasons for this is it directly affects their capacity to care. So again, for personal support workers, they have they don't have amazing tangible benefits such as pay or job security or whatnot. And in most cases, they don't have much power or control over their hours or who they want to provide care to. But how they do their job, whether they work on their own or how they actually do their job is important for them because it determines how much or how effective they can care for their clients or how well they do their job. So I think control is a very important aspect of it. I just wanted to add that.
And if I could just build once more on Firat's point, it's interesting bringing up how much they care. What I found in a previous survey of this same population, the same worker group, the more pro-socially motivated they were. So I had a measure for pro-social motivation, the idea that the work you do is beneficial to others. The higher they rated there, the more emotional exhaustion and burnout they experienced, particularly because they didn't have the resources to actually deliver the quality or extent of services that are kind of promised by the philosophy of the organization, right? Promising very individualized services or high participation in the community. Well, workers can't provide those because there aren't enough staff or there aren't enough resources to live up to the expectations of what high quality service looks like. So if you really care, you're going to be more burned out as a result.
Thank you for that. Any other questions?
If we have time, could I ask a question to Anna, if possible?
By all means, go ahead.
Anna, so in your study, you focus on the gender aspect of workplace violence and harassment, which is a very, very valid point. Is there any other social identities that could be having a similar impact on this phenomenon? Have you looked into it, or are you planning to look into it besides gender as well?
Well, we look not on this study, but it's related to it, to street workers, informal workers on the streets, like, for example, waste pickers, and there's no protections. And I think this convention, as I said, since it recognizes the streets as a workplace and also the informal market, can be a very interesting tool to give name to what they suffer, huh? Like police violence, or sometimes, you know, there's sometimes stores owners from a certain region that don't want them there, all this type of thing that we could give the name of violence and harassment due to their work. So I think it has a potential as a regulation.
Thank you.
Any other last questions or thoughts?
I do have a question for Firat.
Okay.
I was intrigued by the high proportion of immigrant workforce in your study, and did you find workers who identified as being new Canadians or perhaps not born in Canada? Did they experience rates of violence any different than the rest of your sample group?
That's a great question, Robert, and I hope to do a more in-depth study on this. But if I remember correctly, it's been a while, but I also did an analysis basically testing the same model only with an immigrant population and a Canadian-born population. And we didn't find any significant difference. Just to give a perspective, personal support workers, I think the #1 source country is from Philippines, then Jamaica, and then others. But mostly they are visible minorities. And many of them are actually have been already working as healthcare workers. But just to give you a perspective, as I mentioned, about 70% of the sample has a college degree or higher, and most of these people are actually immigrants. When we look at the Canadians, they tend to have a lower education level among personal support workers. But anyway, I digress. So that's a great point. We didn't find anything in this, but I think immigration or immigrant identity, which encompasses so many other social identities as well, cultural, ethnicity, or gender is a big one. But that's definitely something to look at, and I will definitely be looking into that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And apologies for the phone ringing interruption. That's the hazards of doing these things from home.
Jason, I believe Ellison Starkey raised her virtual hand.
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't know if she was applauding or if she had a question, but. Oh, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I was just applauding all of the speakers. This has been a really interesting conversation, and it's been great to hear the dialogue back and forth between the presenters. Just wanted to thank, that's all.
Okay, well, I'll put up one more call for questions, and give the last chance for someone who had a last second. Oh, right, I wanted to ask that. If not, then let me thank all four of our presenters today. Interesting and thoughtful presentations. I want to thank you all for the time for presenting your research, and to thank all the participants for logging on and carving out a small chunk of your day to participate today. So hopefully you'll enjoy other sessions during the course of the next couple of days as we do the conference, and I wish you all a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you everyone who presented and attended. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care now.